I'm sure as software developers, you are always dealing with number of challenges. And when it comes to software composition analysis, some of your challenges could be component identification, version management, vulnerability detections, false positive, negatives, dependency chains, lack of context, privacy concerns, continuous monitoring, and resistance to change, right? Developers' resistance to change. So despite all these challenges, there are definitely lots of benefits of software component analysis, composition analysis in terms of security, compliances, risk management, making it a very essential practice for organizations developing software using open source components. So today we are going to be listening from experts and understanding how to uncover and manage your open source risks in the software supply chain, right? So while we are waiting for some more people to join in, I have a poll to share. I'd also like to welcome others who have joined in a little later, right? So before I introduce the speaker for the day, I would like to launch a poll and understand what are the challenges that you are going through at present. Right. Yeah. So what is your biggest challenge when it comes to managing open source risk? Is it reducing security vulnerabilities? Is it minimizing legal and IP license exposure? Or is it replacing obsolete components? Or maintaining an accurate and up-to-date software bill of materials? Is it all of the above? Or do you have some other challenge that we have not listed here? And if you have some challenge like that, which we have not listed, you can just put it in the chat box. Do share your challenges if it is not one of these in the chat box. And if you have any questions during the session, please post your questions in the Q&A box. So we make sure we address it, get it addressed for you, right? So I'll wait for some more people. Great, 75% of the people have responded. Lovely. All right. So that's interesting, right? I'll wait for a couple of more minutes. We have some more people joining in. So I'll keep this poll on for some more time. So what is your biggest challenge? Those who are joining in while this poll is on, it will be great if you can participate in the poll. And the poll is about your biggest challenge related to managing open source risks, right? Is it reducing security vulnerabilities, minimizing legal and IP license exposures, or replacing obsolete components, or maintaining an accurate and up-to-date software bill of materials, or is it all of the above? And in case you have a different challenge, do post it in the chat box so we can get the experts here to address it for you, right? Superb. So we have 78% people who have participated in the poll, and we have an interesting result, right? So I'm sharing the results with all of you. We have all of the above topping the list, which is 66%, and reducing security vulnerabilities is 25%, and very few to the rest of the stuff, right? So on that note, I would like to welcome all of you who have given your time today to us to hear from our experts and see how you can apply these insights in your business and contribute to your organization, right? So thank you so much for your time today, and we will make sure that this session is super useful for you and it is worth your time, right? So I would like to introduce today's speaker. We have two speakers today. So our first speaker is Greg Rivera, and as Vice President Product Highlights at SCA at CAST, Greg leads product strategy for the CAST. Okay. He helps organizations adopt effective open source risk management, and he has worked with Fortune 1000 companies such as Microsoft, IDG Communications, and Arrow Electronics. and he has over 20 years of experience in technology. So guys, do make the most of his expertise, ask a lot of questions, and take some deep insights with you today. He has been helping clients make successful digital transformations. Greg also has a BS in electrical engineering and an MS in management of technology. And he's very passionate about applying technology to improve everyday lives. So I'd like to welcome Greg, and thank you for your time today, Greg, to share your expertise and experience, and so that our community can make the most of it. Over to you, Greg.
Okay, thank you so much, Vandana. Good to be here, everyone. Welcome. Good day to you all. So as Vandana gave a really good introduction there, we're going to start off with just an overview, setting the stage on how organizations are getting smarter about managing open source risk. But we're going to start off with just describing some of the challenges, go into how they're accomplishing that, and then we'll have a really good story from a real world example coming up right after that. So let's start off very quickly at the beginning of the story here. And the fact is, open source is now everywhere. In fact, over 70% of enterprise applications use some level of open source components. Now, there's a lot of good reasons why open source is being used. It speeds up the development process, a quicker time to market, more standardization. There's a lot of benefits. But when open source components are used when developing custom applications, it does introduce some risks. Those risks, as we just saw in that poll, are things like security vulnerabilities. Because the open source components are open source and publicly available, so are a lot of the vulnerabilities, which makes it easier to exploit them if a hacker wanted to exploit vulnerabilities in an open source component. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Intellectual property licensing. Now, just because open source software is free, that doesn't mean it doesn't come with any strings attached. And one of those strings is typically a legal license on how it can be used. And that could present some risks. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then finally, technology obsolescence. We do see scenarios where some components, some open source components, even popular ones, end up becoming obsolete because a newer, more modern alternative is released, and the one that your software might be dependent on is no longer being supported. And if that goes on for too long, it could become obsolete and present some operational risks. So there are some risks when using open source software. Let's talk a little bit more about the licensing risk, because this is one that we often see is misunderstood, right? So a very simple example of what we mean when we're talking about licensing risk is, let's say you have an open source component, it's a piece of code, a library, a framework, etc., that a developer is going to be integrating into a software application. Now, most open source components come with some type of license that governs legally how that component can be used. One example of a license is a GPL license. It's a very common license, but it includes specific legal language called copyleft. What copyleft language means, to oversimplify it, is that if this open source component that uses this type of license is integrated into a broader application, so it's integrated into then custom code written by a developer, the legal terms of this license may require that now the entire software application, the entire system, has to be open source, meaning the entire code base of source code has to be shared back out with the community legally. You can imagine how, depending on the type of application that's being developed here, this could be very risky to an organization, especially if it's a proprietary software system or even a commercial application that a software vendor is producing and selling to clients. So that could be risky. There are currently over 350 common open source licenses, each of them having their own unique legal requirements. So here's another very important reason why it's becoming very challenging to manage open source risk in this specific area when it comes to licensing risk. So we just wanted to talk a little bit more about that to explain the challenge there. Okay, but all is not lost. There are solutions out there, And there is technology out there to help us address these challenges. And that technology is called software composition analysis, or SCA is the acronym. SCA basically is a category of software products that are designed to analyze custom-built applications and detect the embedded open source software inside of them. Typically, this is done automatically, and it identifies what are the security, licensing, and operational risks, right? So we have technology that could help us control these risks. Now, that makes a lot of sense. So why isn't everyone doing it? Why is it so hard to do this if there's automated technology for doing this? Well, there are some challenges with the more common or typical approaches to SCA. Most traditional SCA technologies are designed to be plugged in and implemented across all of the developer workstations. And there is a time and place for doing that. But the challenge when deploying an SCA technology that has to be from the beginning installed on every developer workstation is it starts to become very slow and cumbersome to roll it out across an organization, because you could have hundreds or thousands of developers that need to now have this plugin or extension installed on their developer environments. It starts to become very complicated and expensive to roll it out, because now you need to train a lot of users. You need to train a lot of individuals. You need to obviously install and deploy these plugins all over the place. And then finally, the other thing that happens is developers are already fatigued with all of the alerts, warnings, and things that are already built into their developer environments. They're already getting alerts about the quality issues, maybe other security issues, compliance issues, et cetera, et cetera. We're just adding more noise to that. And what sometimes happens, if this is the approach that's taken, is open source risks get lost in the noise and ignored. Because as we know, one thing developers are very good at typically is being very efficient. And when there's something that's a hindrance or a hurdle to efficiency, sometimes they figure out a way how to get around it. And that is not what we're looking for when we're trying to control open source risks here. So what we are seeing is there is a simpler approach, right? And what the analogy we like to use is it's like setting up and operating what we'd call an open source control tower. Think of a control tower that's monitoring flights and airplanes at an airport. And you start off by centralizing and automating the scanning and reading of the source code and the application build artifacts, right? That's the first step, is centralizing that so that you have coverage across all applications without disrupting developer productivity and without having to rely on making sure that this is plugged into all of those developer workstations. The second step is basically that centralized analysis then generates insights that are available via dashboards and reporting. And it also generates what's called a software bill of materials. Some of you may be familiar with software bill of materials, or Sbomb, but we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But this really is as simple as the open source control tower is to deploy. And we'll see a demonstration of this a little bit later in today's session. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about Sbomb, or software bill of materials, because this is becoming a very, very important requirement for a lot of organizations. So basically, the simple explanation of what is an Sbomb is you could almost think of it like a cargo manifest, but for software. So similar to how when a huge shipment of containers and material shows up at a port, it has to produce a cargo manifest that lists all of the contents in all of the containers on that ship, typically before it's allowed to dock or enter a port. You can think of an Sbomb very similarly, but for a piece of software, right? It lists all of the components, especially the third-party or open source components that are used to produce that piece of software, and the additional information about those components. If there are some known security vulnerabilities, what the licensing requirements are, as we just talked about a few moments ago regarding to license. So that's what a software bill of materials is. And more organizations are being required to produce and maintain an up-to-date Sbomb for all of their software, especially if they're selling that software or providing that software to a client or another organization. So the way Sbombs help reduce risks is they essentially create a common language for organizations to transact software with each other, whether that's a vendor to a client, whether that's partners to each other, even inside of a big organization. And Sbomb helps different divisions or departments understand what's included in software when it's being provided. Typically, it identifies all the components, the risks. It's often available in various formats. We'll see a couple of examples a little bit later in today's session. There's also industry standard formats so that it can be machine readable and more easily automatically transacted between different systems and organizations. So there's more human readable formats like Excel and Word, but there's also a couple of XML standards out there to make it more automated between different systems. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. But that's just a quick summary on a software bill of materials. And the contents of a software bill of materials, even though there are standards, at the minimum, an Sbomb should include obviously an inventory of all the components, the details, if there's any security vulnerabilities, the licenses, and if there's any risky licenses, right? So that's the bare minimum. What you'll find is more comprehensive Sbombs could also include additional information. What's the programming language of each component? Are there any potential licensing conflicts, two components having conflicting licenses? Copyright information, legal requirements, any transitive dependencies, additional security advisories from other sources, weaknesses. We'll talk about that because that's an uncommon thing. Or safer versions of a component if an unsafe one is currently included in that Sbomb. Okay, one quick example here before we transition to our next speaker is we've worked with one company at CAS called Broadridge Financial Solutions. They're a large financial tech company in the United States, and they implemented this control tower approach to open source risk management. We're not going to read through this entire text here, but the details there for the follow-up materials when the slides are shared afterwards. But the interesting thing is they had a portfolio of over 400 applications that were leveraging over 13,000 open source components. So they set up and started operating this open source control tower. We worked with them to do that using one of our technologies at CAST. And the incredible results were what used to take them days in terms of their process to approve a new component for the development team to use was reduced down to on average about 10 minutes. So by centralizing this process, automating it with an SCA technology, and then taking this control tower approach, they were able to go from days to approve a new component to a few minutes. So pretty successful example here. Okay, I'd like to just finish up with some recommended best practices here as we open up the session today. Here's a few things that we've learned in working with hundreds of clients across the world from an SCA perspective. First off, no surprise, one recommendation is implement some kind of SCA technology so that you can automate these processes, both the open source risk review process, but also the maintenance and generation of Sbombs. It's critical that you ensure you have buy-in from key stakeholders, but across multiple teams. This isn't the responsibility or you don't need a stakeholder from just one team. Typically what we've seen is you need buy-in across the architecture, development, security, and legal teams, sometimes even a compliance team. So you're going to need buy-in and support across those different teams to be successful. Also, making SCA a standard part of the software development lifecycle. Most SCA technologies can be automated by integrating them into your CI/CD pipelines or development processes. That's very important. And then we've also seen some more mature organizations even create a centralized open source program office or center of excellence that's responsible for open source governance and best practices. And we've seen that work quite well. In fact, in that last example that I just shared with Broadridge, that is exactly what they did. They had and have an open source program office that's centralized under the CIO's office, and it's working quite well for them. So just sharing a few best practices there. Okay, I'd like to go ahead and now transition to our next speaker. I'm going to quickly introduce him
Greg,
and then hand it off to.
Greg,
Yep.
before we move to our next speaker, can we take some questions?
Yeah,
Subramanian
sure.
Sharma is raising his hand. So,
Okay.
yeah. Subramania, I have given you permission to speak. You can go ahead, and if you have any questions for Greg, if you want to ask something, please go ahead. All right.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Vandana. Thanks, Greg. So just I would like to know, I mean, the SCA, this one tools there, you're clearing the softwares and also monitoring the overall vulnerabilities and the software. So what is this one, is it like a continuous integration techniques you are doing it, or what are the kinds of, softwares you use internally to monitor these softwares? And also, how often is it like, this is my first question. My second question is it possible to set up a CI/CD pipeline so that, any versions of the softwares, whatever we are using in our Sbomb, similar to that, what you are having, we are also maintaining that. So we would like to just, take that and then plug and play with another software, and then so that ensure that the continuous monitoring is there, and also replacement of the software is being done automatically by the next versions or the next higher versions of the software. So is it something available with this tool?
Yeah, good question. Thank you for those questions. So from an operational perspective, and again, there's a few different approaches that can be used, but generally speaking, the way that SCA technology works, to answer the first part of your question, is it is doing what's more commonly referred to as static code analysis. And it's also scanning through all of the dependency files and build artifacts to identify all of the embedded open source or referenced open source that's being used within a software application, right? So that's from a technical perspective, what is actually happening. To answer the second part of your question is, yes, it absolutely can be automated. Typically what we'll see is the scan, the SCA scan of applications is going to happen as part of a build process. So every time a new version of an application is being built, it's scanned, all of the information is automatically updated so that when you're viewing the insights or dashboards or reports, which we'll demo in a little while, it's always the latest and up-to-date information. The other thing that some technologies do, and this is something that the one we demo does do as well, is even if you don't do a new scan of a new version or build of an application, there's still things happening with open source components, like a new vulnerability might be detected, a license might change for a particular component. So good SCA technologies are also monitoring those in real time and updating that, even if a new scan of an application has not occurred. So you need to keep both of those things in mind, not only scanning the changes in the application itself, but your SCA technology also needs to be monitoring what's changing with the existing open source component. Even if the version didn't change, there could be new vulnerabilities that pop up. There could be license changes, things of that nature. So all of those things could and should be automated so that you always have the most up-to-date information in your SCA dashboards and reports.
Thank you so much, Greg.
Thank you.
I hope your questions are answered, Subramania.
Thanks, Vandana. Thanks for giving me an opportunity for asking a question. Thank you very much.
Lovely. Can Satyajit go ahead and ask your query, please?
Yes, I was more interested to know how it is different from Black Dog. So when it comes to open source, we use this kind of tools like Black Dog, which gives us all the analytics, and even it can be integrated for Sbomb data. So how this new tool or your tool is different and how it is placed?
That's a really good question. Thank you for asking. So there's a number of players, technologies, SCA vendors in the market, Black Duck being one of the larger ones. We're one of the players in the space as well. The main differences between whether it's Black Duck or some of the traditional approaches and CAST is that first off, we are taking a more centralized kind of portfolio level approach. That's why we use that analogy of control tower. So we're looking at it from across the entire portfolio versus typically in some other technologies are more focused on one application at a time, provide insight. So when we go through the demo, you'll see that difference. The other thing that we do is because we're integrating other insights or context, such as the business impact of applications or things of that nature, which we'll show in a little while, we're able to make more prioritized recommendations on where to focus attention. So we'll show that in a few moments. And then finally, we do a few unique things in terms of identifying weaknesses in components that have not yet been reported as vulnerabilities. So we're allowing users to get ahead of potential future vulnerabilities that might be emerging, but not actually reported by other SCA technologies yet. So we'll show that in a little moment as well. So there's a few differences in our approach. And then finally, we show other insights besides just open source risk. There's things like resiliency and technical debt, cloud maturity, other insights that we have in the technology that you won't get out of traditional SCA products because they're only focused on open source. So that's probably a quick answer to the question, but you'll see a little bit more when we go through the demo in a few minutes on what some of the key differences are.
Okay.
Thanks, Greg. We have Jagdish also, as he has some question, Jagdish. And then we have 2 questions in the Q&A box, Greg, from Vivekananda. So Jagdish, yes, go ahead. And you can also let us know which organization you're from. Jagdish, are you able to unmute yourself? All right. If not, then can we take the questions in the Q&A box? Vivekananda is asking, is it being mandated by any regulatory compliances like ASPICE or ISMS or any plans moving forward? That's his first question.
Yeah, so good question. I am not personally familiar with those 2 designations, organizations, but what I do know is that more and more different organizations all over the world are starting to put regulation in place regarding the production and maintenance of up-to-date and accurate Sbombs for applications. One example, in the United States, there was an executive order released by the federal government 2 years ago requiring any software that is being provided to the US federal government is going to need to come with an accurate Sbomb. So that's one example that I'm familiar with. And I know I've heard of other examples in other countries and markets across the world. So there is more regulation coming and we expect that to continue for sure.
And there is a following question from Vivekananda again. What would be the impact on small time players in tier 1 levels?
I'm not sure I really understand that question, Vivekananda. If you could maybe follow up, I can type the answer while our next speaker is speaking. And maybe that would be the best way to answer that one.
So Vivekananda, I unmute yourself and you can elaborate on that question because even I didn't understand that question. So if you're there, Vivekananda, would you want to elaborate on that or?
Yeah, sure. You're able to hear me now?
Yes, lovely.
Yeah, okay. Hi, Greg. We are actually playing in the tier 1 levels of automotive technologies. Okay, I just wanted to know what would be the impact of such kind of activity on us, because the reason is like we usually OEMs purchase softwares from different tier 1 players actually. So would this be done or mandated at regulatory complaints? That was the first question actually, which you have answered. The second question was, if this is going to be mandated as a necessity from all the small time players, what would be the impact? Because I just wanted to understand what would be the price of this, and would this really fit into our budget, whether we'll be able to maneuver through all this process. I just want to know so I just want to know what would be the impact of this particular activity bringing into SDLC.
Got it. Okay, thanks for clarifying. I mean, quite simply, even for a tier one organization like you just described, it is going to become mandatory for organizations that are providing any kind of software to their clients to have an accurate software bill of materials. And if the regulation is not already in place in a particular industry, it is probably coming very soon. So that is going to have an impact, which means most organizations are going to need to have a solution. Trying to do software bill of materials manually, although it is theoretically possible, is incredibly challenging and time consuming. So the recommendation is that you do have some type of automated technology like SCA to help automate that process. And there's obviously different SCA products. We're going to focus today on one called Cast Highlight from our company. If you're interested in seeing what it costs, our pricing is actually on our public website. So you can take a look at its, different levels of pricing are available depending on the size of an organization. So I think that pretty much covers the two questions.
So before we move on to the next speaker, we have one more participant having a question. Banamali Mishra, please go ahead. And I hope I have pronounced you correctly.
Yes. Yeah, thanks, Mona. I agree. I have one question. So I just want to know, is this tool identifies only the known vulnerabilities or also the known anomalies? And one follow-up question is, for the known vulnerabilities, the vendors basically they generally don't publish all their KVs to the NBD or some sorts of database actually. So if it is actually internal, how this tool will fetch those CVs or vulnerabilities?
Got it. Okay, so a lot there. I'll try and answer it without getting too overly technical. But the specific technology that we're talking about here, Cast Highlight, does report on vulnerabilities from multiple sources. So that includes not only the traditional national vulnerability database, which everyone should be using and reports official CVEs or common vulnerabilities and exposures. We also use the GitLab security advisories community alerts. That's another source of vulnerabilities. And then we have our own proprietary technology that actually looks inside the code of open source components automatically and identifies weaknesses, or CWEs, which stands for Common Weakness Enumerations. These are weaknesses in the code of software that represent likely a future vulnerability. So we're able to detect that weakness probably weeks or months before it eventually becomes an officially reported CVE in the National Vulnerability Database. So those are three examples of different sources that we have. If we're talking about own source, meaning it's not public or open source or third-party code or components, that typically is up to the organization if they know that there is a vulnerability. But our technology will also provide insights into custom or proprietary code around things like resiliency, complexity of the software, things of that nature that could represent possible vulnerabilities. But if it's not public code, it's not going to have an official CVE or common vulnerability and exposure designation, because the definition of that is it has to be publicly available. So that's how that would typically work.
Thank you, Rick. Actually, yeah, one more question was that does this tool also fetch known anomalies, or it is only the known vulnerabilities?
So that is when I talked about weaknesses, that is probably the closest thing to what you're talking about in terms of anomalies.
Okay.
It will detect those weaknesses in the code. Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Greg.
Yep.
So we have Rennie Varghese also raising his hand. Rennie, could you wait? Is it a related question? Or can we wait to address this question a little later? We can wait. Lovely. Thank you so much. Over to you, Greg, to introduce our next.
Yeah, thanks, Vandana. So, and great questions, everyone. So you've obviously been looking at our next speaker's name here for the last few minutes while we've been answering questions. So I'm excited, though, to officially introduce our next speaker, Jagadish Ramaya. He is the CTO of Vitrana. And as the CTO and Vice President of Product Development at Vitrana, they are a leading solutions provider in the life sciences space. Jagadish has 28 years of experience in software architecture, design, and development in notable organizations such as Haman, Microsoft, Oracle, and others. He's got a very strong technical background with experience in multiple technologies. And in the role as senior architect at multiple organizations, he's been instrumental in achieving code quality via best practices in software development and with the help of various development tools. So we're super excited to have Jagadish here to speak with us. I'm going to go ahead and pass the virtual stage over to you. Jagadish, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
So thank you, Greg. I'm audible, right?
Yes, and we could see your slides as well.
All right, thank you so much. All right. Thanks for the intro, Greg. So basically, I'll start off with a very quick intro about the company that I'm working in. Right. So basically, ours is a software development company. Right. We develop software and provide consulting services as well in the life sciences space, right? So which means that it is a well-regulated space, and there are a lot of regulations and compliances that we as software developers or software providers need to follow. All right. So this is one of the reasons why Vitrana has to make sure that whatever software we develop and then sell to the players in the life sciences domain, this software is really clean and it does not have any of the OSS related issues, security vulnerabilities, and stuff like that Greg talked about just a while ago. All right, and this was one of the reasons why we had to worry a lot about what we are developing, right? What are our processes as part of software development? And I think as IT teams or as teams that develop software, all of us will have these questions, right? Am I doing the right thing, right? And if you look at the typical software development process in any company, right, in any software company, right, once you have the requirements either from the customer or from your product team, right, when you actually start developing that, right, these are some of the things that you would go through. Of course, obviously, you do the initial design. You will pick a technology, right, depending on your on the design and the requirements, right. And the first thing that you would look at is what are the existing libraries that are there, which can fill the gaps, which can provide some of the functionalities that I'm already looking at, right. I'll give you a very simple example, right. Suppose you need a date picker, right, on your website to choose a start date and an end date, right. You wouldn't start designing how to implement that. Instead, what you would do is you'll start looking at, is there any control that is already available, right? Is there any component, right, that I can use in my software and then make my software development much quicker, right? So this is something that everyone does. And of course, obviously, that's the way to go. However, only thing is that you have to be a little bit careful over there. And then, you'll start doing the development, right? There will be developers assigned various different, parts of the development tasks, right? And then what a developer does, right? He starts writing code for the design that is given to him, right? And here is again, things that can go wrong over here. I'll cover it in the next slide. And then once he develops the code, compiles, does the unit testing, check in, you have your CI/CD process, DevOps process, right? And then you would do your QA team would come in It will conduct all the penetration tests, system tests, performance tests, etc., etc. Right? When all the issues are fixed, we'll do a final release. And this is a typical development process that anyone would follow in their software companies. Now, it kind of looks like this is perfect, right? Nothing can go wrong in here, right? And in spite of it, what we see in the industry and what we saw at Vitrana also was that the quality of the product that came out of this process, right, was not meeting the expectations. It had a lot of issues, right? And it was not compliant, right? Why? Where things went wrong. So let's take a look at that. Where can it go wrong? All right. So one thing is your external libraries. Of course, we did, spend some time looking at Googling and then finding out, okay, this particular library has whatever functionality that I want, right? So I'll go ahead and pick that. But as a development, as a developer, did I go ahead and look at what are the licenses associated with this component? Right? Is it free to use? Is it paid? Right? Or are there other terms and conditions which will, make me, force me to kind of open up my source code? Right? So we generally, as developers, we don't look at that. We all, all we are interested in is to see whether my functionality that I wanted is there in that particular component or not. Right? Where can I click on it and then download it and use it in my software? That's all we'll be worried about. This is one of the reasons why, we run into issues, right? And then, even if someone kind of, downloads that license thing, it is, you cannot really interpret that. And there are multiple interpretations of all these different licenses. As Greg mentioned, there are some 350 plus types of licenses. Right, and obviously all these licenses come with one or the other, thing wherein it will be a liability on you. Right now, there are a couple of things like compatibility among the different libraries, and there could be known security vulnerabilities within those components. Right, so these are some things that the developers don't worry about, and that is the reason why things go wrong. Right now, other than the third-party components, right, during the development, developers also, try to use code snippets. They just do go Googling, and they see a piece of code, a piece of function, either in your Stack Overflow or whatever it is. Right, there would be a lot of code available over there. You do copy paste in your code, and then you get your development task completed within time. Right now, again, we as a developer, we don't look at whether there were any license issues with that. Is that code copyable or not? Right, and we don't even, when we copy the code, we don't even give credit to the original creator. We don't say where we downloaded it from and who was the original author. Right, and then there could be known vulnerabilities in that, and known vulnerabilities are really an issue. We'll talk about that a little bit later. All right, and another place where things can go wrong is, the lack of capability among the developers, or probably the lack of discipline, wherein, they would introduce security vulnerabilities while writing code. And the code could be, a bad performing code wherein, it may not be written in the best possible way. Right, the code could be, really badly organized, where the functions are written haywire, or there could be a huge code, right, which is all written in one place. It's very, not easy to debug and stuff like that. Right, so these are some of the issues that will plague a product that has been built internally. Right, and obviously we need someone or something to identify all these things, so that the code finally, when it gets released, are free from all these things. All right. So one of the things that, as a development team, we have to do is, or as a manager or as an IT leader, we have to enforce is that there has to be good coding practices for the technologies that are being used within your company, right? And for the third-party components, make sure that you have an approving authority for all the third-party components. You may call it, some kind of a committee, right? Or one single person authority who will have the necessary tools with him, right? Who can take a look at the third-party component that has been chosen to be used within your code, go through it, go through the licensing, use a tool which can highlight to him saying that, there is something wrong with this third-party component, right? Use that and, basically approve or disapprove at one level. You cannot rely on the developers to take that call. All right. So the next thing is modify your DevOps process to run a SCA tool like cached highlight that Greg was talking about, right? Which will generate the right kind of reports on your OSS. There's open source software, third-party components, right? And give you reports about the code quality, the security vulnerabilities that have been hidden in your code, right? Whether it has been written right, whether it performs right? So all those things, code health, tech depth, etc. All right, and make sure that these reports or the process that you would follow for your product development, they generate the report starting from day one, right? Don't accumulate all these findings, to be fixed at a later point of time. It's never going to work. They have to be green from day one. And when code is getting added every single day, make sure that the reports are green, and whatever has been introduced by a developer, they get fixed immediately. All right, tech depths. Now, tech depths is something wherein we are using the framework or perhaps some components, some libraries, right, which are older version, right? So these are really critical because have using an older version which has known vulnerabilities is more dangerous than having a bug in your own code. And the reason why is because the known vulnerabilities out there on the net, right? Any hacker would be trying to hack that particular vulnerability, that particular opening which can give him control over the machine or the software or the data, right? Known vulnerabilities, people know how to hack because the known vulnerability also comes with how to hack, right? So it's even more dangerous to keep such known vulnerabilities and older versions of software. And you need a tool which will highlight all the things, which says that this is software version which has vulnerabilities, please upgrade, right? Unless someone is pointing to you and telling you that this needs to be upgraded, we as developers or development teams will never find time for that, because we are always running against time for delivering whatever we need to deliver. All right. So at Vitrana, what did we do? We of course did a lot of finding out about what are the different tools that are there, and we did read up all the reviews, and we also went with certain references, and finally we chose Fast Highlight as the SCA tool for our development team. Right. And once we did that, and once we adopted within our development team and our CI/CD process, right, we started getting reports about all the issues, right, that are there in our code. Right. So as you can see, I have just put some screenshots of some of the reports that Cast Highlight had created for one of our projects. Right. So it actually talks about your software resiliency, software agility, right? Right, and the code, the health, right? The risk that is there, right? So it is going to talk about every single aspect of your SBOM, right? That Greg we talked about. And these reports are helping us make sure that the code quality that we have, that we are churning out, is consistently high and maintainable. All right. So that's all I had to share with you about what Vitrana did to adopt the tool, basically cast highlight. And I'll hand it over to Vandana. But if there are any questions, I can take it.
Right. So we do have Satish Kumar has raised his hand. So I'll just yeah, go ahead, Satish. You can unmute yourself and speak.
Yeah, thank you, Vandana. Thank you very much. So one quick question. So you mentioned about the known vulnerabilities when we use some third-party libraries. So there could be a chance for some of the libraries that they don't publish the known vulnerabilities publicly, right? So we can't find anywhere. Like for example, there are few libraries I've seen. So we are not able to get those things, and those are open source. How will you manage those libraries?
All right. So basically, what will happen here is that Satish, is that as part of our DevOps process and as part of our HDLC, though the SCA tool identifies all the known vulnerabilities, right? It also makes sure that it scans the code, and then if at all there is any a piece of code which has been wrongly written, or if there is some uninitialized variable that is being used, right, which can cause the program to crash. So such things it's always going to catch. Right? All the code smell issues, code health issues, all those things it raises as high, medium, low, and critical categories. Right. So we as developers make sure that all the high, medium at least and critical are handled. Right. That is one thing. Second thing is that even after the product has been developed and deployed, right, as part of the SDLC, we do have penetration tests. Right. We do have tools which does penetration tests. We actually at Vitrana we use Burp Suite for that, wherein the application is bombarded by hacking requests by the tool, and if at all there is anything in it which is kind of overlooked in the coding phase, even those things get caught at that point of time.
Okay.
So thank you so much for answering that question, Jagdish. Anyone else has any questions for Jagdish before we move on to the product demo? All right. Vivekanand has raised his hand. Yeah, please go ahead and unmute yourself. I think you already have the unmute permissions. Vivekanand? Yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
The question is, now there are new vulnerabilities which would be coming over a period of time, right? So how does this a tool is going to get trained over a period of time? Like for example, in antivirus, we have definitions getting updated on a weekly basis or frequently a daily basis also. So how is that this tool is going to get updated for the new vulnerabilities, and how is that we are going to filter such kind of vulnerabilities moving forward?
Right. Thanks, Vivekananda. So this is an obvious question, right? And just like how antivirus keeps on updating its signatures, right? The SCA tool also keeps updating itself, right? And the day, say, suppose recently we had this log4 Java, right? Log4j issue, right? Bug. The very next day, the cast highlight tool raised that issue, saying that you have log4j and this is a vulnerability that is found. Right. So it keeps on updating, and it has to be up to date to the last minute, because anything that has been found as a vulnerability needs to be highlighted, and then fresh scans need to be done for all your projects. And usually, like what you do is that you configure running these these scans almost like every day at the end of the day, or perhaps whenever you do your daily builds. Right.
Okay.
So at that time, the updated, Sbombs database would be used to make sure that anything that is known as a vulnerability or a newer version that has been introduced, right? All those things it will highlight.
Okay.
Greg perhaps can give a little bit more information on how this is done internally.
Right. And I think there's one more question, which again, Greg can respond to that while we are doing the product demo. How caste is different from check mark? Ashish Chakrabarti has asked that question. So over to you, Greg. Thank you, Jagdish, for answering those questions and
Sure.
for your time here today.
Thank you, Vandana.
It was lovely hearing your insights.
Thank you.
All right, yeah, thank you, Vandana and Jagdish. Thank you very much. I think a lot of the questions that have been coming up, we will answer during this demonstration portion of the session today. So let's go ahead and just jump right into that. So what I am showing right now on the screen, I'll make it full screen here. I'm logging into our SCA product, which is called Cast Highlight. Cast Highlight, like we've been talking about, acts like a control tower for applications. And as you'll see here on this home screen, it's producing insights in multiple categories, not just about open source. So very quickly, I'll touch on how you've got a category of insights around what we call software health. This is analyzing the custom or proprietary code, not the open source code. This is the custom code being written by developers and providing insights on things like resiliency, agility, complexity, technical debt to help improve the health of the software, make it perform better, make it more resilient, et cetera. So that's one area. Cloud ready, this one's pretty self-explanatory, but what this is looking at is generating insights on how ready and a software application is to be migrated to the cloud in a cloud native state, or take advantage of what's called platform as a service, right? So it's looking inside the code, understanding it, and identifying how ready it is to go to the cloud. Open source safety, this is a category that's all about SCA, or software composition analysis. That's where we'll spend most of our time today. And then our newest category is called green impact, where it's looking at how sustainable is the software, right? Are there things going on in the software that are unnecessarily making it use more resources, consume more energy, and ultimately emit more carbon into the environment? So that's a new area of the product as well. But today we're going to focus on open source safety. Now, just to set the stage, a couple of things. All of the dashboards that I'm going to demonstrate for you in the next couple of minutes are generally driven by two inputs. Number one, primarily a scanning of the code and the application build and the dependency files, et cetera. So that's what we've been talking about. But we also have a second input that we use to enhance the analytics. We will add more contextual information about the applications by pulling in data from other systems like an enterprise architecture system or CMDB, or we have a built-in survey capability for capturing information about each application. For example, the business impact of each application. Because if you have dozens or hundreds or thousands of applications, they're not all the same level of importance to the organization. So you might want to focus on applications that have a higher business impact to the company than other applications in the portfolio. This is one, just to highlight one thing, one very unique difference between Cast Highlight versus other traditional SCA players like a Black Duck or a Checkmarks. The fact that we also are adding that business context on top of the technical, automated technical insights that are generated by analyzing the code base. So let's see how the combination of those two actually come into play. So if I click on this open source safety tile, it's going to bring me to, let's start off at the control tower view, a portfolio level view that's looking across all the applications. And here we have a screen that we call our portfolio advisor for open source. And what this is doing is it's looking across all of the 200 plus applications that are in this example environment and automatically recommending priority actions for a subset of those applications. So it's looking at and identifying, for example, that there's 5 applications that need immediate attention, meaning that have multiple issues. They have critical security vulnerabilities. They have risky licenses, things of that nature. And these 5 applications also have a high business impact score. So we're going to prioritize and recommend. Cast Highlight's going to tell me, you need to start here because these are your highest business impact applications and they have multiple open source issues. So that's what that's showing me here. Then we have 11 applications here where the priority action is to fix the vulnerabilities. Again, there's a high business impact, but the issue with them is primarily vulnerabilities, security vulnerabilities. We have 3 applications here where the priority recommended action is to look at the licenses, evaluate the legal risk, right? We have 12 applications where the priority action is they're using older components, older versions of components. So you need the priority action there is to upgrade those components to the latest version. Then we have 6 applications where the business impact is lower, so they're not as important. So these you could start worrying about maybe later on in the process, but you might want to consider alternative components for these applications. Even though they have a lower business impact score, they still have some issues. And then finally, we have a group here, a couple of applications we call role models. These are applications that actually have very low risk. They're using very safe open source components. So the reason we flag this is that this could be an opportunity to learn some best practices. What components are these applications using? What practices are the development teams working on these applications using? Because they have very safe third-party frameworks and components and libraries in their applications. So we're going to bubble up those role models because maybe there's something to learn there, right? So this is one of the very unique aspects of Cast Highlight relative to other technologies out there like a Black Duck or a Checkmarks. The fact that we're not only automatically analyzing the application for technical insights like vulnerabilities, for licensing, compliance, et cetera, and risks, we're overlaying context, business context, so that you have more informed decision-making and automated recommendations here on where to focus your attention, which could be overwhelming if you have hundreds or thousands of applications. Here, we're identifying, okay, here's where you focus your attention to start, right? So that's one unique example of the technology for Cast Highlight. Okay. One of the other things that's unique about Cast Highlight is because we take this centralized control tower approach, right, where we're starting at the high level and looking across everywhere, you can very quickly understand what's going on across all of your applications in just an instant. So Jagdish mentioned a very good example. A little bit over a year ago, we had this global issue with a popular open source library called Log4j. Right, and a lot of organizations were struggling and very quickly trying to understand their exposure to Log4j. Well, organizations that were using Cast Highlight, because it takes this control tower approach, they were able to come to this components tab here, and very quickly they could just type in Log4j, and lo and behold, instantly they see, okay, I am using Log4j. I can see what the data is associated with this, and I could see right here that I have 18 applications in my portfolio that are using this component. If I click on that, I could see which versions of Log4j are in use and what are the vulnerabilities there. So again, because we take this control tower centralized approach, users and organizations that had this in place when the Log4j issue happened, within 5 seconds, they were able to very quickly assess their exposure to Log4j, understand what versions in use and which of their applications are exposed to it, right? So that's another unique aspect to Cast Highlight, is taking that control tower centralized portfolio view. All right, so we've shown, there's a lot of other things we could show here, but very quickly I want to show a couple of things. Let's drill down to one application now, because then you start to understand what happens at the application level. So I'm going to pick one of these applications that happens to have Log4j, and I'm now leaving the portfolio level view and I'm coming down to this one application. This application is called Experience This. Again, we have a lot of different types of insights here. I mentioned things like the health of the application, cloud ready, green, but we're going to focus on software composition. And here you'll see this application has 12 critical, 38 high, 30 medium, 2 low severity vulnerabilities, right? So these are the officially reported CVEs. We also report on advisories. This is a second source of security information. So these are the GitLab advisories community. So that's another source of information that we're reporting on, right? And then we'll see license risk. So we have 2 risky licenses. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Down here, we'll see all of the components that have been automatically detected within the code base of this application. So we can take a quick closer look at one of them. For example, this one here is a good example. So if I click on this component, it will bring up a view that shows me, if I click here, the version I'm using. I'm currently using a version that's quite old, 9 years old. That's a bit of an extreme, although you'd be surprised how often we see this out there with, organizations using components that are 9, 10 years old, right? But I'll see it has a critical and 2 high severity security vulnerabilities. It also has 14 CWEs. We'll talk about that in a moment. We'll see there, here's the timeline of each version of this component, the subsequent versions. And I'll see if I actually upgraded to the latest version that was released a few months ago, I no longer have those critical or high severity vulnerabilities or those CWEs. So they've been fixed, right? So you can see very quickly how this is critical information to show what my team needs to do to get away from that version of this component that has those vulnerabilities in it. Now, if you have hundreds or thousands of applications, opening this screen and scrolling through the timeline is a little bit impractical. So that's why over here, we automatically identify what's the safest version of a component you can go to. And this information could be automatically exported, pushed into another tool like a Jira ticketing system to create issues for the development team. So we automatically identify, you don't have to manually go look at which version to upgrade to. The product automatically identifies the safest version. The other thing it's looking at is these CWEs. This is interesting. So I'm going to click on here. So for example, log4j, if I click on CWE, this is a unique aspect of cast highlight. CWEs are weaknesses. And the only way you could detect a weakness is if you actually analyze the source code of the piece of software, meaning that we have a technology that is out there analyzing the source code of these open source components. Since the source code is publicly available, we have a process running constantly that's analyzing the source code of log4j in each of their versions and looking for structural quality defects like weaknesses. And then when we find one of those weaknesses, we actually then report it in cast highlight here. We're the only ones that are doing this because we have the ability with one of our other technologies at the company to understand semantic code analysis and structural quality. And then we report those weaknesses here, right? What is a weakness? What is a CWE? Well, it's an issue in the code of software that is likely going to result in one day becoming a vulnerability. So we're getting ahead. We're actually helping our users get ahead and giving them advanced warning on possible future vulnerabilities, potentially weeks or months before they are officially reported in the National Vulnerability Database or some other registry of vulnerability data. So we are the only ones on the market that have this type of technology. And this is another unique aspect of cast highlight relative to some of those other SCA technologies on there, that we can report CWEs or weaknesses that represent emerging or future vulnerabilities that have not yet been reported. Okay. We talked about licenses. So let's look at a license view. So this application is using a bunch of different components with a lot of different licenses. But as you can see here, there's a couple of risky ones. Remember we talked about that GPL license earlier in the session that has the copy left language? Well, here's an example of a component that's using one of those. One of the other things that is unique in cast highlight component has this GPL license. If I click on that, it opens up what we call our open source rule book. And it shows you the license text here, right? But most of us are not legal IP or intellectual property experts and understand exactly what the legal requirements are by reading this text. So what the technology is also doing is it's automatically interpreting the license in a more user-friendly manner here and creating this rule book. So it's in a color-coded, fashion here, showing you what does the license allow legally, what doesn't the license allow, what does the license require you to do, and what additional properties are there. So this is a user-friendly, easy to understand rule book for most of us that are not intellectual property experts, so that we understand before I use this component, or if I'm already using this component, what are the legal requirements without me having to go through and try and understand the legal text of this license. In this case, this is one of those restrictive licenses that has that copy left language that we talked about earlier. So I might want to consider an alternative component, or at least have my legal team take a closer look at how I'm using this to make sure I'm not violating the legal requirements of the license for this component. So that's a little bit on licenses. We talked about software bill of materials. So at any time, you can create automatically a software bill of materials directly out of Cast Highlight. So it's available in a few different formats. We have an Excel format. We have Cyclone DX, which is an industry standard. We have a Word format here. I'll show a quick example. So here's what the Excel format looks like. This is typically more for a technical audience, and it has all of the information that you would need to produce and send with a piece of software if you're required to produce a software bill of materials. We also produce it in more of a Word version. This is designed for a different type of audience. This is designed more for a legal or compliance audience. So if you need to produce a software bill of materials that's more for the legal folks in an organization, you can export it in this Word version, which focuses a little bit more on the licensing information that's included as part of all the components in a piece of software. And then obviously we can produce it in what's called Cyclone DX, which is that industry XML format for integrating with other systems. Finally, you can also, what we're also seeing out there is organizations needing to import an existing SBOM, right? So for example, you might receive an SBOM, or a company might receive an SBOM from another organization, and you need to actually import that into your own system and understand the contents of that. So here you have the ability in Cast Highlight to actually import an SBOM that was produced by some other organization. And once you upload that and save it, here, I'm not going to do it now, but I could show you one that I've uploaded in the past, another application here. This is actually an application, here it's loading here. This here is actually an application that was not scanned by Cast Highlight. I actually received the SBOM file from another organization. I imported it into Cast Highlight, and then it had updated it with the latest information on security vulnerabilities, licensing, and things of that nature, right? This is a small application that's only using 5 components, but it's just an example of how now we're seeing organizations not only needing to produce an SBOM, but also consume an SBOM for a piece of software they're getting from somewhere else. So you have both of those options in Cast Highlight. Okay, I think that's a very quick but pretty good demonstration of Cast Highlight and SCA technology in action. This is the technology that Jagdish presented that they're using at Vitrana. So I'm going to kind of stop there, but hopefully you understand how Cast Highlight's a little bit unique in that it takes that control tower view. It adds that context, the business context for a little bit more informed decision making, right? It's taking that centralized view so you could quickly understand what's going on across applications. And then finally, it's trying to stay ahead, right? It's looking ahead, identifying possible future vulnerabilities that are currently represented as weaknesses in an application. So that's a pretty good quick demo of Cast Highlight in action. So just to kind of summarize here, we take a different approach. It could be up and running and operational across hundreds of applications in a couple of weeks. Recommendations with that context, looking ahead. And just to give you an idea, I know that there was a question on pricing. It's also priced very competitively in the market. Our pricing is public, but you can just get a quick comparison here. We typically price by the size of the portfolio on some of the other users and clients of the technology. So I think I'll leave it at that. And Vandana, I'll hand it back over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. There are two questions, Greg, in the Q&A box. One is from Sonal Bagul. The question is, in case of any new CV release for some package, will cast highlight flag it for the old scans done for some application in case that vulnerable package and version is part of that application? Or we need to run a fresh scan on the application code to get the details of that CVE presence?
Great question. And the answer is it will detect it without requiring a rescan. So Cast Highlight is continuously monitoring new vulnerabilities that are popping up. And if a new vulnerability pops up that is in your code base, you do not need to rescan the application. It will automatically notify you both in the user interface, and the users of the product can also subscribe to an automated email. So you would automatically get an email notification telling you, hey, there's a new vulnerability in one of your applications. Here's the components in with a hyperlink directly to the vulnerability information. And that will happen whether you rescanned the application or not.
Thanks, Sonal, for that question, and Greg for that response. Sarang has a question. Does this tool also support scanning low-code platforms like OutSystems, Power Apps, and Mendix?
So yes, absolutely. So if you're familiar with those low-code platforms, the actual application that is produced by low-code platforms is written in a traditional programming language like Java, C#, etc. And since those are standard programming languages, those are supported by Cast Highlight. So the code that's produced by low-code platforms and those applications can be analyzed by Cast Highlight just as if it was written from scratch or like a traditional custom developed application. You can see on our website, we have a list of all of the technologies and programming languages we support. Currently, there's over 50 different programming languages and technologies that are supported by the product.
There's one more question from Anup in the chat box. Does Cast detect secret keys in GitHub or GitLab libraries?
Does Cast detect secret keys in GitHub? That might be a little bit beyond my technical knowledge, but what I will say is that we do have many of our clients that are using Cast Highlight with GitHub as their or GitLab as their source code repository. The product can be configured to detect specific patterns in the code base of an application, wherever that code lives, whether it's on GitHub, GitLab, or any source code repository. So if the secret key is something that is a string or pattern that can be detected by a code scan, then yes, Cast Highlight could automatically detect that and configure to do that. We may already have some existing patterns in the product that are already designed to detect secret keys, but forgive me, it's not an area of expertise for me. The other thing, just so you know, is we have out-of-the-box extensions for GitHub. For example, we have a GitHub action for automating the entire process that we've just described if you're using GitHub as your source code repository. So it's a very nice way to deploy the technology if you're using GitHub.
So we have two more questions, Greg. How to integrate with code repositories like Bitbucket? Raju is asking this question.
Yep. So I was just starting to answer that coincidentally with the last question. So we have out-of-the-box extensions for a lot of the popular code repositories, whether that's GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket, Azure DevOps, wherever you're keeping your code. So it's plug and play. You plug it in and it automatically scans the source code. If you're using some more older or less popular source code repository system, we have a number of automation tools like a command line interface that you could easily write a simple script to automate the analysis of the code using Cast Highlight. So regardless of what source code repository you have, we either have an out-of-the-box plugin or extension already available for it, or we could work with you to write a simple script to automate the scanning process even if it's something that's maybe a little bit older or not as common. So yeah, we could automate that regardless of what you're using for your source code management.
I think there's a few more questions that are coming up in the Q&A box. Kirti is asking, I've seen the license details of the libraries which I am using, but I haven't seen the risk factor, even in open source initiative web pages, who maintain the open source licenses. So just curious to know how CAST is categorizing the license risk. May I know how we should interpret the license risk?
Got it. Okay, so there's an out-of-the-box risk profile, I'll call it, or template that comes with the product. And that risk is based on typically industry standard risk levels. We look at sources like there's a very popular website called choosealicense.org that will automatically identify recommended risk levels. So out of the box, we have a standard risk identifier profile. However, the technology lets you completely customize that. And you could customize your license risk profile and template at the portfolio level, or you could have a unique license risk template at an individual application level. We have clients that have multiple license risk profiles because their legal team has decided to customize what comes with the product out of the box. And you can do that based on that rule book I was showing. So like you can define your risk level based on what rules or requirements are being detected within the license based on the color coding elements that I was showing in that license rule book. So there's flexibility to do it both ways. You could either use our out-of-the-box definitions or you can customize or create your own.
So we have two more questions, Greg. So I think it's time for the second poll. So if you could just type those answers, is that all right? Satish Kumar and Vikas has some questions, and I could just run the second poll. Right. So it's time for the second poll. It's time for you to reflect what would be your top priority in the next 6 months to handle open source risks in your organizations. So I've launched the poll, and in the meantime, Greg can respond to those two questions Vikas and Kirti, I think, is having. Right. And while you are answering this poll, I would also like to give an introduction to Meteonic Innovation. Hi, I'm Vandana from Meteonic Innovation. Ankur and I co-founded Meteonic 17 years back. And with over 350 plus clients, we are empowering software development community to boost your productivity and performance, stay focused on your core business, go to market faster, right? And avoid unnecessary stress related to product deliveries. Right. So on that note, if you would like to schedule a detailed demo or POC with your teams, I have shared the link in the chat box. You can fill that up so we could give you priority meetings. We can prioritize your request. So please go ahead and fill. Anyways, you have our WhatsApp number. If you have received messages from us for this webinar, you could also write back to us. Right. So I do have the poll result here. And I'm going to end this. I'll wait for some more time. So what is your topmost priority to address open source risk in the next 6 months? Implement an SCA technology, create a Sbombs program, establish a centralized open source governance group, or automate the open source risk review process, or all of the above. So we do have the responses here, and 50% of the audience says all of the above. 20% says implement an SCA technology, 15% says establish a centralized governance group and automate the open source review process. I've shared the poll results with you. You can have a quick glimpse on that, right? All right, so all right, Greg. Okay, I'll read out the questions for you, Greg, because there are two.
For some reason, they're not loading for me now. So if you could read, that would be helpful.
So Satish Kumar is asking, are there any custom source links that SCA tool look for existing CVs other than NIST, NVD, and GitHub security repositories?
So I think the question is asking if there's any other sources. So today, the sources that CAST highlights looking at is the NVD, the GitLab advisories. And then we have our own source, which I described when I was going through the demo of the CWEs or the weaknesses. That's a proprietary knowledge base that we build of weaknesses in open source components. So I believe we're the only ones that have anything like that. So those are the three primary sources of the vulnerability and security issues that we have built into the technology today.
Right. So Vikas is asking, does this tool support SAST and DST scan?
No, that is not something that we do. Those are other types of technologies. What we just described is focused on SCA. We do not perform SAST or DAST. No.
Right. So Venugopal has a question, where the data from customer application scan is located and what potential consequences customers could face in the event of a compromise of the CAST platform?
Okay, so the interesting thing about the approach that CAST takes is that all of the scanning of the code happens locally within the environment of the organization. So we don't need access to the source code. The analysis all happens locally. So wherever the source code lives, that's where the analysis happens. The only thing that the analyzer produces is a results file, which is just statistical results. That statistical results file, you could open it up and look at it. It's just a flat CSV text file. That is what gets pushed up to our portal. And then all of the insights are produced, right? So that is very important to understand, is that we don't need to see the source code. We don't access the source code. That all happens locally. We can provide all of the information that you need on all of our security and data management processes. We go through some pretty rigorous certification. We're ISO 27001 certified. All this information is available on our website in our FAQ section. So we can certainly supply all of our data management practices and certifications when it comes to how we maintain data security and compliance.
Thank you so much, Greg. And all right, there's one more question. How can I identify which third-party library is risk-free? For example, I want to use data picker in my application and lots of free libraries available in the market. Is your application provide such type of suggestion? I mean, does your application provide such type of suggestions?
Yes, absolutely. So you could actually, even if you haven't gone and scanned an application, there's a couple of things that you can do inside of Cast Highlight. One of them is, let's see if my screen's still showing. Okay. One of the things you can do is at any time, you could actually search our entire knowledge base of over 100 million components, right? So you don't actually have to scan an application to look up information about it. So you could type in any component that you're considering using, and it will search our knowledge base and actually bring that information up. So I'm having an internet connection here in my home office, so forgive me. But so that's one thing that you can do, is you can do that. Whoops, let's see if I can get this to work. You can do that query. The other thing you can do here is you could actually upload. See, here we go. So if I just pick this, and then I'll get all the information. So I just did a quick search for a component that I'm considering using. Here's all the versions. Here's the license, any CVEs, etc. I could also upload the code of a snippet or component I'm thinking of using by selecting it as a file. And I could actually upload that. Cast Highlight will look at it and identify it if it's a known component, and then do that same check for you. And then finally, we have a Chrome browser plugin. It's a free plugin if you're a Cast Highlight user. You install this Chrome browser plugin, you'll see it right here. And when you're browsing open source repositories, it will automatically pop up information about the component you're currently looking at. So if you're on GitHub or what have you, and you're looking at a given component, obviously it's not going to detect anything here because I'm not in a known repository right now. But if I were in GitHub or NPM or whatever, and I have that plugin installed and I'm looking at a given component, I can click on that and it'll tell me all the information about that component, if there's any vulnerabilities, what the license is, etc., that kind of thing. So there's a few different ways to do that.
Right. So thank you so much, Greg. I'd also like to thank Jagdish for taking out time and sharing how CAST has been helpful to him. And thank you, Greg, for sharing your insights. It's quiz time, guys. So I'm going to be sharing my screen. I've shared the quiz link in the chat box. You will have to use this pin 504585. I'll give this link again in the chat box. And I'm going to be starting the quiz. Please rename yourself appropriately because we need to know who the winners are. So please put appropriate names while you start playing this quiz. One second, sorry. Right. Right, go ahead.
Quiz.com. A past student joined.
What is the estimated percent of applications that
Sister
currently
Fork
utilize
joined.
open source components?
Ankur Marotra joined.
Over 70%. Which of the following are common risks when using open source components in software development?
Fluffy Steam joined.
All of these listed here. What does Sbombs stand for?
Nayank joined. Random Lion joined.
Software bill of materials. Which of the following are typical challenges when adopting a traditional SCA technology?
Mr. Runak joined.
All of these listed here.
Final question. Double points.
Which of these open source licenses is most likely to cause legal exposures to an organization? GNU GPL v3.0.
Third place, Sarang Barpat. Second place, Fluffy Data. And the winner is
Fluffy Data is
Vive KG.
right. So thank you so much for being such an active and participating audience today. We really enjoyed you having with us today. And thank you for asking those useful questions. So I think you know the next steps. If you would like to have detailed demo or proof of concept with your team, do let us know and we are here to serve you. So thanks everyone for your time today. Thanks, Greg. Thanks, Ramaya, and everyone who was present here today.